I never thought the day would come when my own family would treat me like I was invisible. Margaret Walker sat in her living room, the weight of the world on her shoulders. The house that once echoed with laughter, love, and memories now felt colder than ever. She had just buried her husband, George, the man who had been her rock for over 40 years. He was gone, and with his death, everything had shifted. But what hurt the most wasn't the emptiness of the house or the silence that followed his passing. It was how her own son, Jack, and daughter-in-law, Rachel, looked at her as though she were nothing more than a burden. Margaret had spent her life dedicated to her family, loving them unconditionally, sacrificing her own desires to see them happy. But now, it seemed all that mattered to them was what they could get from her. It was at George's funeral that it all became clear. Jack had barely acknowledged her, his eyes avoiding hers, his conversations focusing only on the logistics of the estate, the house, and everything they assumed was theirs. Rachel, always the polite one, wore a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her words were sweet, but her actions spoke volumes. They treated her like she was broke, like she was nothing without her late husband's wealth. Margaret didn't have the heart to correct them. She didn't have the energy to explain. They had no idea. They had no idea about the $28 million her husband had left behind. The fortune that had been passed down to her alone. She hadn't told them. She didn't need to. Why should she? Let them think she was struggling. Let them believe she was powerless. She had endured their disrespect for too long, and now, she was going to enjoy the silence. But deep down, she knew something had to change. They didn't deserve to be a part of her life anymore, not after the way they treated her. She had been the one who held the family together all these years, and now, in the blink of an eye, they were treating her like an outsider. It wasn't just the funeral. It was the way they'd spoken to her over the years. It was the way Rachel had casually suggested she move into a retirement home. The way Jack had spoken of selling the house George and Margaret had built together, brick by brick. They acted like she didn't belong in her own home, her own life. Margaret felt her heart ache, not just from the loss of George, but from the realization that her family no longer cared for her. It was a gut-wrenching feeling, one she hadn't expected. But as she sat there, staring out the window at the cold, empty street, something inside her clicked. She wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to let them control her. Not anymore. Margaret had spent her whole life making others happy, putting their needs before her own. It was time for her to take control of her own future. But she wasn't going to fight them in the way they expected. She wasn't going to yell or beg for their affection. No, Margaret would do something they would never see coming. She would remain calm. She would remain quiet. And when the time was right, she would show them just how wrong they were to underestimate her. Her family thought they could push her aside, but they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Margaret Walker wasn't some fragile old woman to be ignored and forgotten. She had been the heart of that family, and she would remind them of that in the most unexpected way. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the inheritance. It was about respect, and she was going to take it back, one quiet move at a time. Margaret sat by the window, staring out at the world that seemed to go on without her. The funeral was over, the visitors had gone home, and the house that had once been filled with joy and love now felt suffocatingly silent. She felt the weight of her loss pressing on her chest, not just the loss of her husband George, but the loss of what she thought she still had in her family. She had tried to hold everything together for so many years, but now, she was invisible to them. It wasn't just the funeral, it was everything that had led up to this point. Jack, her son, had never been particularly close, but she had hoped the bond they shared would hold strong after George's death. Instead, he barely acknowledged her. The coldness in his eyes when they spoke was unbearable. It hurt more than she had expected. Rachel, his wife, had always been polite, but today, her politeness felt more like a performance. She wore her sympathy like a mask, one that Margaret could see right through. It was as if they were both already calculating what they could take from her. The house, the assets, the future. They had plans, and none of those plans included her. She had been a part of this family for so long, giving and sacrificing. But now, they acted as if she were a stranger, a problem to be solved. She had seen the way Rachel talked about downsizing her living arrangements, as if Margaret wouldn't be able to keep up with the bills. The insinuations were subtle, but they were there, sharp and cold, like the winter wind outside. It wasn't that Margaret needed their help. It was that they assumed she did. They assumed she was just a burden, someone to be dealt with and disposed of quietly when the time came. It stung. Margaret had been strong for so long, but the cracks were starting to show. Still, she refused to let them see how much their treatment affected her. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But the truth was, as much as she tried to hold it together, she felt utterly alone. She knew she had the money. She knew George had left her everything. But she couldn't bring herself to flaunt it. It felt wrong, like she would be proving them right if she let them see her wealth. But every day, it weighed on her. She had been silent long enough. They had treated her like she was nothing. They had no idea how much she was capable of. Margaret looked at the phone on the table. It had been ringing off and on all day. She hadn't answered any of the calls. She didn't need to hear more of their excuses, their false apologies. They didn't deserve to speak to her. She didn't need them. Slowly, Margaret stood up, walking across the room to the kitchen. She wasn't sure what she was doing, but something inside her was stirring, a quiet determination. She couldn't live like this anymore, pretending to be weak when she was stronger than any of them could ever understand. As she opened the drawer, her fingers brushed over the papers inside. There it was, the document from George's lawyer, the one that confirmed everything. The inheritance, the fortune that no one knew about, the one that would change everything. Margaret had never planned on telling them. She didn't want to play their game. But maybe it was time to remind them of who she was. Maybe it was time to stop hiding behind the silence. She picked up the phone and made the call. She wasn't sure what she was going to say yet, but she knew it would be the last time they would ever treat her like this. She wasn't going to be their pawn anymore. Not when she had the power to change everything. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed Jack's number, but there was a quiet resolve in her heart. She was done being the invisible woman in her own family. It was time for them to learn the truth. They had underestimated her, and that was their mistake. Margaret stared at the phone in her hand, the weight of what she was about to do pressing on her chest. It had been a week since George's funeral, and she had spent that time in silence, quietly observing her family, letting them believe they had control. She hadn't spoken to Jack or Rachel since the funeral, but today felt different. Today, she would take control. The phone call had been short, but it had shaken her to her core. Her lawyer had confirmed it all. The house, the investments, the fortune George had left behind. It was hers. But no one knew. Not Jack, not Rachel. They all thought she was just a frail, forgotten woman who was clinging to the remnants of a life that no longer mattered. Margaret had let them think that. She had let them assume she was weak, that she would just disappear into the background, forgotten like so many older people who were discarded by their families. But Margaret was not like the others. Margaret had loved, worked, and sacrificed for this family for decades. She had earned every penny, every brick of the house that they now seemed so eager to take from her. She had given them everything, and now it was time for her to take something back. Slowly, Margaret rose from the chair by the window, her mind made up. She had been silent for too long. She wasn't going to let them walk all over her anymore. It was time to make them understand just who they were dealing with. She dialed Jack's number. It rang for a few moments before he picked up, his voice cold as usual. "Mom, what's up?" he asked, sounding distracted. "We need to talk," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm. "About what?" Jack replied, the impatience in his tone clear. "About the house," Margaret said. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What about the house?" Jack asked finally, his voice now guarded. "I'm not giving it to you," Margaret replied simply. There was silence on the other end of the phone. Margaret could almost hear Jack's mind racing as he processed her words. He had expected her to fold, to cave in, just as he and Rachel had planned. But Margaret wasn't the woman they thought she was. "Mom, you don't understand," Jack began, his voice rising slightly. "This house is too much for you to handle. You can't live here alone." "I can handle it just fine," Margaret interrupted, her voice unwavering. "And I'm not moving into a retirement home, either." Jack scoffed. "You don't have a choice. This place is too much for you. We've been talking about selling it for months now." Margaret could hear the frustration in his voice, but she didn't let it affect her. "I don't care what you and Rachel have been talking about," she said coolly. "You don't get to make decisions for me." Jack let out a sharp breath. "Mom, this isn't about you. This is about the future. You don't have the energy to take care of this place. It's not about you. It's about practicality. I've taken care of this house for over 30 years, Jack," Margaret said, her voice steady. I'm not giving it up just because you and Rachel think it's too much for me. Jack was silent for a moment. Then he spoke again, his tone shifting slightly. I don't understand, Mom. Why are you being so stubborn about this? Margaret felt the familiar pang of hurt, but she pushed it aside. I'm not being stubborn. I'm making a choice. And you're not going to change my mind. Another pause. So what do you want, Mom? Jack finally asked. Margaret took a deep breath. She had made her decision, and she wasn't going to back down. I want you to stop treating me like I'm invisible. I want you to stop assuming I'm helpless. I want you to respect me, and I want to keep the house. Jack's voice was tight now. This is crazy, he muttered. We've been trying to help you, but you're making this so difficult. Margaret felt a flicker of anger rise, but she kept it in check. You've never been trying to help me, Jack. You've been trying to control me. I'm done with that. Fine, Jack snapped. But don't expect me to just sit back and watch you waste everything. This house isn't worth the trouble it's causing. Margaret's voice softened, but her words were firm. It's my house, my life, and I'll do what I want with it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Margaret could almost hear Jack struggling to process what was happening, but she wasn't going to let him twist her words anymore. She wasn't going to let him make her feel small. She was in control now. I'll be over later to talk more, Jack said, finally breaking the silence. No, Margaret said, her voice resolute. I think we're done talking for now, but you'll hear from me soon enough. She hung up the phone before Jack could respond, her hand steady as she placed the receiver down. Margaret stared at the phone for a moment, letting the silence settle in the room. She felt a sense of calm wash over her, a certainty that had been missing for so long. She wasn't just an old woman waiting to be taken care of. She wasn't someone to be pushed aside or forgotten. She was Margaret Walker, and it was time the world, and her family, remembered that. Margaret stood in the doorway of the kitchen, staring at the empty house. The silence was oppressive, louder than any argument or disagreement she had endured in the last few weeks. She had made her decision. She had confronted Jack, and for the first time in a long while, she had stood her ground. But now the weight of what she had done settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had told him that she wasn't going to give up the house, that she wasn't going to let him and Rachel take control of her life. It felt liberating in a way, but at the same time, it made her heart ache. She wasn't used to being this firm. She wasn't used to saying no, especially to her only son. But as the days passed, it became clear that her decision had left a mark. Jack didn't come around for the next few days. Margaret knew he was angry, but that didn't matter to her anymore. She wasn't going to back down, and she wasn't going to let them push her out. It had been a week since that phone call, and Jack had yet to speak to her. Margaret could only imagine what was going on in his head. Was he plotting something? Trying to figure out how to get her to change her mind? Or was he just biding his time, waiting for her to relent? She didn't care anymore. She wasn't going to be swayed. But the silence between them felt different now. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from peace or understanding. It was the silence of war. A quiet, simmering battle where no one was speaking, but both sides were waiting for the other to make the first move. Margaret had her answer, but Jack wasn't ready to accept it. Margaret walked through the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. She had lived here with George for so many years, and now it was just her. She thought about the time they had spent building this place, the years of memories they had created together. It wasn't just a house to her, it was a home she had fought for, a home she had built with love and care. She wouldn't let anyone take it from her. Not Jack, not Rachel, not anyone. As she passed by the living room, her eyes landed on the family photo hanging on the wall. It was taken years ago, before everything changed. Before George became sick, before Jack became distant, before Rachel had wormed her way into their lives. It was a picture of a happier time. A time when they had all been together, laughing, loving, enjoying life. Now it felt like a lifetime ago. Margaret stopped and stared at the photo for a moment, the memories flooding back. She remembered the days when Jack was a boy, when he would run into her arms after school, when he would sit on her lap and tell her about his day. Those days felt so far away now. She remembered when George had held her hand and promised her that no matter what, they would always be together. That promise had been broken, and now, she was here, alone, fighting for something that should have never been questioned. She took a deep breath and turned away from the photo. The past was the past. There was no going back. But there was something she could do now. She could take control of her future. Margaret made her way to the study, where George had spent most of his time in the final years of his life. She sat at his desk, the chair creaking under her weight. She looked at the papers scattered across the surface, the legal documents that had once seemed so foreign to her. But now, she understood them. She understood the power they held. She had been given everything, and she was going to hold on to it. Margaret picked up the envelope on the corner of the desk. It was sealed, addressed to her. She had received it the day after George's funeral, but she hadn't opened it yet. She knew it was from George's lawyer, but she hadn't felt the need to read it. Not until now. She tore open the envelope and pulled out the letter. As she read through it, the words became clearer, the meaning more profound. There was no mention of the estate being divided. There was no mention of Jack or Rachel inheriting anything. The house, the money, everything was hers. She wasn't just some old woman waiting to be taken care of. She was a woman in control. She had power, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. The letter confirmed everything she had suspected. It confirmed that she was not powerless, that she had a future beyond the limitations Jack and Rachel had tried to impose on her. They had underestimated her. They had thought she was weak, that she would give up without a fight. But they were wrong. Margaret folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. She knew what she had to do next. It was time for Jack and Rachel to understand that they had made a mistake. It was time for them to see just how wrong they were. Margaret didn't need to yell, didn't need to fight. She knew the truth. And soon, they would too. Margaret's heart raced as she stood in front of the door, her fingers hovering over the doorknob. It was the morning after she had read the lawyer's letter, and the truth was finally sinking in. For so many years, she had been the one giving, the one supporting, the one always taking a back seat. But now, she realized, it was her turn to take control. Jack and Rachel had no idea what was coming. The morning had passed quietly, but she knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. The quiet had been broken by the sound of the doorbell ringing. She didn't have to guess who it was. She could already picture Jack, standing there, full of questions, likely furious, trying to figure out what she was up to. Margaret took a deep breath and opened the door. There he was, looking every bit like the son who had grown so distant from her over the years, but still carrying that hint of a little boy who used to trust her completely. He looked at her with those familiar eyes, but they weren't the same anymore. There was no warmth in them. Just suspicion, confusion, and anger. "Mom, we need to talk," Jack said, his voice strained. He stood on the doorstep, not stepping inside, but making his presence known. "I know we do," Margaret replied calmly. "But not the way you think." "What's that supposed to mean?" Jack asked, his jaw tightening. Margaret didn't flinch. She had been preparing for this moment. It was time for him to hear the truth. "It means," she said slowly, her voice steady, "that I'm not giving you what you want. Not the house. Not anything. This is my life, and I'm going to live it how I see fit." Jack's face twisted in disbelief. "Mom, you don't understand. We've been talking, and Rachel and I." Margaret cut him off. "I don't care what you and Rachel have been talking about," she said. "You think I don't see what's been happening? You think I don't know you've been planning to take everything from me?" Jack's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't speak. "For years, you've treated me like I'm invisible. You've treated me like I'm nothing," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. "But I'm done with that. You and Rachel can't push me around anymore." Jack stepped back, his expression turning defensive. "This isn't about me, Mom. This is about what's best for you. You're not getting any younger. You can't keep up with all of this. I've been taking care of this house for over 30 years, Jack. I know how to manage things just fine," Margaret said. "You don't get to decide what's best for me anymore." Jack's eyes narrowed. "I don't get it. Why are you doing this? Why not just let us help you?" Margaret shook her head. "You think you're helping me? You think selling the house is helping me? You've never cared about what I want. You've only cared about what you and Rachel want. And now, you're going to see what happens when you push me too far." There was a tense silence between them. Jack opened his mouth as if to say something, but Margaret held up her hand. "I've been patient with you for too long," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I'm not going to sit back and let you walk all over me. You don't get to control me anymore. This is my house, my life, and I'm not giving it up." Jack's face flushed with frustration. "You're being unreasonable, Mom," he said, his voice rising. "We've been nothing but supportive, and this is how you repay us." Margaret looked at him steadily. "You think you've been supportive?" she asked. "You think treating me like I'm a burden is support? You think ignoring me and planning behind my back is support? No, Jack. You've been using me, taking advantage of me, and now you're going to find out that I'm not as easy to manipulate as you thought. Jack took a step back, clearly rattled. I don't know what happened to you, Mom, he muttered. You used to be different. No, Jack. I used to let you walk all over me, Margaret said quietly. But not anymore. Jack stood there for a moment, staring at her, the anger in his eyes still burning. But Margaret didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. She wasn't afraid of what he could take from her. She wasn't afraid of losing him either. She had lost enough over the years, and it was time for her to stand up for herself. You're making a mistake, Jack said, his voice low. I don't think I am, Margaret replied calmly. But you'll see soon enough. Jack hesitated, his face a mix of anger and confusion. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Margaret standing in the doorway. She watched him go, but she didn't feel the usual pang of sadness or guilt. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. The silence in the house was no longer suffocating. It was her silence, her space, her life. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. She knew this was only the beginning. There would be more fights, more manipulations, more attempts to push her into a corner. But she was ready for them now. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Not ever again. The days following Jack's visit were quiet, but the tension in the air never seemed to dissipate. Margaret could feel it in every corner of the house, in every creaking floorboard, every whisper of the wind outside. Jack had left, but his absence had only made the silence more pronounced. The anger, the frustration, it all lingered, like a storm waiting to break. And Margaret knew that storm was coming. She had seen the way Jack looked at her, the way his eyes flashed with something that was more than just frustration. It was a mixture of disbelief, betrayal, and something darker, something she couldn't quite place. But it didn't matter. She wasn't going to let him control her anymore. She wasn't going to let anyone control her. The letter from George's lawyer, the one she had read in the quiet of the study, had been her moment of clarity. It had confirmed everything she had suspected but hadn't dared to hope for. The house, the money, the legacy, everything was hers. And now, she was going to make sure it stayed that way. Margaret spent the following days in quiet contemplation. She didn't rush to make decisions, but she knew that the time to act was drawing near. She could feel the pressure building. She had already made her stand, and now it was time to make the consequences clear. But there was something else she had to do first. She had to confront Rachel. Margaret had been avoiding Rachel for a reason. She knew the woman didn't care for her. Rachel had always been polite, always put on a show of being the perfect daughter-in-law, but Margaret knew better. She had seen the way Rachel looked at her, the way she would speak in that condescending tone, like she was doing Margaret a favor by being in her life. Margaret had tolerated it for far too long. It was time to put an end to it. Rachel's visit came unexpectedly, just a few days after Jack's departure. Margaret knew it was coming. Rachel had always been one to try and smooth things over, but Margaret wasn't interested in any of Rachel's false niceties. She wasn't interested in hearing how sorry Rachel was or how much she cared about her. Margaret had heard it all before. The doorbell rang, and Margaret didn't hesitate. She opened the door to find Rachel standing there, wearing that same polished smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. Margaret, Rachel said sweetly, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. I thought we should talk. I agree, Margaret replied, her voice calm but firm. She stepped aside to let Rachel in, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Rachel glanced around the house, her eyes scanning the room as if she were taking inventory. Margaret couldn't help but notice the subtle way Rachel's gaze lingered on the furniture, the artwork, the details. She was already making judgments. Margaret could feel it, like a quiet accusation in the air. It's a beautiful home, Rachel said, her voice smooth but carrying an edge. I know George was very proud of it. He was, Margaret replied, her tone neutral. And so am I. Rachel didn't respond to that. Instead, she glanced at Margaret, her smile tightening just a bit. Look, I know things have been tense lately, Rachel began, her voice taking on that familiar false sweetness. Jack and I just want what's best for you, Margaret. We want to help. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Help? Or control? The words slipped out before she could stop them, and for a moment, Rachel's smile faltered. What do you mean by that? Rachel asked, her tone suddenly defensive. Margaret didn't back down. You've been trying to push me around for months now, she said quietly. You've been trying to convince me to sell the house, move into a retirement home, do everything you think is best for me. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. We're just trying to help you, Margaret. You can't handle all of this on your own. The house, the upkeep, everything. It's too much. Margaret shook her head. I've been handling this house for over 30 years. I don't need your help, Rachel. Not now, not ever. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but Margaret held up her hand. And another thing, she continued, her voice steady. I don't need you pretending to care. I see through it. I know exactly what you're after. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Rachel looked at her, the mask of politeness slipping just a little. I'm not sure I understand, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret stepped closer, her eyes locked on Rachel's. You've always been about what you can take from this family, Margaret said, her voice low but powerful. You've never cared about me. You've only cared about what you could get, what you could take from George, from me, from this house. Rachel's face reddened slightly, but Margaret didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid of Rachel anymore. She wasn't afraid of anyone. I'm done being used, Margaret said firmly. And I'm done being treated like I don't matter. Rachel stood there, silent for a moment, before she finally spoke, her voice cold. You're making a mistake, Margaret, she said softly. We're just trying to help. Margaret shook her head. No, you're not. And I don't need your help. You and Jack can do whatever you want, but I'm keeping this house. And I'm keeping everything else. I don't need you, and I don't need anyone else trying to control me. Rachel didn't speak for a long time, her eyes searching Margaret's face as if she were trying to find something to hold on to, something to use against her. But there was nothing. Margaret was resolute. Finally, Rachel turned and walked out of the house without another word. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching her go. It felt like a victory, but it wasn't over yet. She knew Rachel would try again. She knew Jack would try again. But Margaret had made her decision. She wasn't backing down. Not this time. Days passed, and the house felt different. Margaret could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the only sound breaking the silence. She had made her stand, but she knew this wasn't over. She could feel it in the air, the pressure was mounting, and Jack and Rachel were not the type to give up easily. They would be back. Margaret wasn't sure when, but she knew they would come. She had prepared herself for this, though. She had learned to be patient over the years. She had spent her life waiting for moments like this, the moments when she could finally take back what was rightfully hers. And now, with George gone, the time had come. It had been a few days since Rachel's visit. The woman had left without another word, her expression tight, her smile forced. Margaret knew Rachel was angry, but she wasn't interested in Rachel's feelings anymore. The woman had shown her true colors, and Margaret had no intention of backing down now. But she couldn't help but wonder what Jack was thinking. Was he plotting something? Trying to find a way to break her down? Margaret hadn't heard from him since their last conversation, but she didn't expect to hear from him. Not yet, anyway. He needed time to process, time to figure out how to regain control. But Margaret knew that the longer he waited, the more frustrated he would become. She wasn't sure how it would unfold, but she knew one thing for certain. Jack and Rachel wouldn't be the ones calling the shots anymore. Margaret had already made up her mind. She had spent too many years bending to their will, giving in to their demands. It was time for her to stand on her own. She wasn't going to let them manipulate her anymore. The house wasn't just a building to her. It was a symbol of everything she and George had built together, a life, a legacy, a family. And no one was going to take it from her. The next morning, as Margaret was having breakfast, the doorbell rang. She had just poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table when she heard the familiar chime. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew exactly who it was. She stood up slowly and walked to the door, taking a deep breath before she opened it. There stood Jack. His expression was tight, his eyes guarded. But something in his demeanor told Margaret that he had come to talk, or maybe to demand. He looked at her, his jaw clenched. "Mom," he began, his voice strained. "We need to talk. Now." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but firm. "What is it, Jack?" she asked, not stepping aside. Jack hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "I've been thinking about what you said," he started, "and I still don't understand. Why won't you just let us help you?" Margaret crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Help me? Or control me?" Jack flinched slightly at her words, but he didn't back down. You don't get it, Mom, he said, his voice lowering. This house, this life, it's too much for you now. We're trying to make things easier for you. We're trying to take care of you. By taking everything from me. Margaret replied, her voice unwavering. By pushing me out of my own home? That's not help, Jack. That's manipulation. Jack's face flushed with frustration, but he didn't speak for a moment. Margaret could see the conflict in his eyes, the confusion, the anger, the sense of entitlement. He didn't understand. He still thought he was doing what was best for her. But he was wrong. I'm not trying to control you, Mom, Jack said finally, his voice quieter now. I just want what's best for you. You're not getting any younger. You can't keep up with all this. You're going to need help sooner or later. Margaret stared at him, her eyes hard. I don't need help, Jack, she said, her voice steady. Not from you, not from Rachel. I've been managing just fine on my own. You're the one who doesn't understand. You think you're doing what's best for me, but you're not. You're doing what's best for you. Jack looked at her, his frustration evident. This is crazy, Mom, he muttered. You're making this so difficult. You don't have to do this alone. Margaret shook her head, her expression unchanged. I've never asked for your help, Jack, she said softly. And I won't start now. This house is mine. My life is mine. And I'm not going to let you or anyone else take it from me. Jack's face twisted with anger. You're being unreasonable, he said, his voice rising. You're refusing to see what's right in front of you. Margaret stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. No, Jack. You're refusing to see what's right in front of you. You've been treating me like I don't matter, like I'm just some old woman who needs to be taken care of. Well, I don't. I'm not going anywhere. And I'm not giving up this house. Not now, not ever. For a moment, Jack stood there, silent, his eyes locked on hers. There was a flicker of something in his gaze. Anger, disbelief, maybe even guilt. But Margaret didn't flinch. She wasn't backing down. Jack finally sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. Fine, he said, his voice low. But don't expect us to just sit back and watch this. Margaret didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew what was coming next. But she was ready. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back now. Jack turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the porch. Margaret stood there for a moment, watching him go, before closing the door. She didn't feel the usual sting of disappointment, nor the wave of guilt that used to wash over her. This time, she felt something different, something stronger. She felt like she had taken back her life. And no one, not Jack, not Rachel, was going to take it from her again. The days after Jack's visit were long, and Margaret spent them with a sense of calm that was new to her. She didn't feel the guilt she once would have, and the weight of the house, which had always felt so heavy, now felt like a solid foundation beneath her feet. The silence in the house was no longer an enemy. It was her companion. She had been alone before, many times, but never like this. Never with a sense of control. As the days passed, she waited. She knew Jack and Rachel wouldn't let this go. They would try again, in some way. She just wasn't sure when. The knock on the door came 2 days later, just as Margaret was finishing her breakfast. She had been sitting in her usual spot by the kitchen window, watching the world go by, when the sound of the knock broke her reverie. She didn't need to guess who it was. There was only one person who would come after the conversation they'd had. Margaret stood up slowly, setting her coffee cup down on the table, and walked toward the door. She didn't rush. When she opened it, there stood Jack. His face was tight, his posture rigid. It was clear he had come with something to say, but Margaret wasn't going to let him control the conversation. She stood in the doorway, looking at him steadily. We need to talk, Jack said, his voice a little more strained than usual. Margaret crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. About what? She asked, her voice calm but firm. About everything, Jack replied, his tone softer now, almost pleading. Mom, this isn't how it's supposed to be. You're not making this easier on any of us. And what exactly should be easy, Jack? Margaret asked, raising an eyebrow. Should I just give up my life, my home, for the sake of your comfort? Jack's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, as if he were trying to gauge how much of the house he could take in before facing her. I don't know why you're being so difficult, he said finally, his voice flat. You're only making things worse for yourself. For all of us. Margaret's gaze didn't waver. I'm not being difficult, Jack, she replied evenly. I'm just finally standing up for myself. You and Rachel have been taking from me for so long, and now it's over. I'm not going to let you control me anymore. Not this house, not my life. Jack's face flushed, and for a moment, Margaret thought he might argue. But instead, he just looked at her, a mixture of disbelief and frustration in his eyes. You're being unreasonable, he muttered, looking down at the ground. Margaret didn't flinch. She had expected him to say that. She had expected him to be angry, to lash out. But that didn't matter to her anymore. I'm not being unreasonable, she said quietly. I'm doing what's right for me. Jack opened his mouth to say something, but Margaret held up her hand, stopping him. No, she said, her voice firm. I'm not going to listen to you tell me what's best for me anymore. You don't get to make decisions for me. Jack stepped back, clearly taken aback by her words. He hadn't expected her to be so resolute, so sure of herself. Margaret stood there, her heart steady. She didn't feel the familiar pang of guilt or the need to apologize for asserting herself. She was done apologizing. We'll figure this out, Jack said finally, his voice quieter, almost resigned. But don't think this is over. You can't just keep everything from us, Mom. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there, watching him, waiting. Jack seemed to realize, in that moment, that the conversation was over. He nodded stiffly, his frustration still apparent, but he knew there was nothing more to say. He turned and walked away, and Margaret watched him go, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over her. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew she had made her choice. She wasn't going to give up the house. She wasn't going to back down. She had fought for this life, for this home, and she was going to keep it. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt free. She had finally taken control of her future. And as Jack's footsteps faded away, she felt a deep, quiet satisfaction settle in her chest. She wasn't going to let them take anything from her again. Weeks passed, and the house remained silent, but Margaret no longer felt the oppressive weight of the quiet. She had made her decision, and with every passing day, she felt a little lighter. The calmness was something she had never experienced before. She had spent years chasing after the approval of others, especially her family, but now, she wasn't running after anyone. The phone didn't ring as often as it once had. Jack didn't call, and Rachel didn't stop by with her carefully crafted smiles. It was almost as if they had accepted that Margaret wasn't going to back down. But she could feel the storm brewing beneath the surface. They hadn't given up, and she knew they would find another way to try and take control. Margaret wasn't naive. She knew they were plotting, trying to figure out how to get what they wanted without directly confronting her again. She wasn't sure what they were waiting for, but she knew the day would come when they would make their move. It was an afternoon, nearly a month after the last conversation with Jack, when the knock on the door came. Margaret had just finished her lunch and was sitting by the window, looking out at the yard. The house was still quiet, as it had been for weeks. She didn't even need to wonder who it was. She knew. As she opened the door, there stood Jack again. This time, there was no anger in his eyes. There was no frustration. He looked defeated. Margaret didn't say anything at first. She simply waited for him to speak. Jack shifted uncomfortably on the doorstep before he looked up at her. Mom, he began, his voice softer than it had ever been before. I've been thinking about everything you said. Margaret studied him for a moment. There was something different about him now. He wasn't the same man who had come storming to her door weeks ago, demanding that she give up her life, her house, her legacy. This Jack seemed tired, worn down by something only he understood. Margaret didn't rush him. She didn't speak. She simply waited. Jack took a deep breath, his hands shoved into his pockets. I know I haven't been the best son, he said quietly, looking down at his feet. I've been selfish. I've been focused on what I thought was best for everyone else, without even thinking about what you needed, what you wanted. Margaret's heart tightened, but she didn't let it show. She had heard apologies before, but this one felt different. Jack, she said finally, her voice steady, I know what you wanted. You wanted to take control of everything, of me, of the house, of my life. But that's not what I want. I don't need anyone to take care of me. Jack nodded, though he still couldn't meet her eyes. I realize that now, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been wrong, and I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. I thought I could fix everything. But I see now that I can't fix this. Not if it means taking something from you. Margaret studied him, wondering if he truly understood. For the first time in a long time, She felt like she was looking at the son she had raised. The boy who had once trusted her, who had once been close to her. But that boy had grown up, and in doing so, had become someone she didn't recognize. Jack, she said softly, this isn't about fixing things. It's about letting me live my life the way I want to. And that means you have to let go. Let go of the idea that you can control everything. Let go of the idea that you know what's best for me. Jack was silent for a long time. Then, slowly he nodded. I can do that, Mom. I will do that. Margaret looked at him for a moment longer, and then she stepped aside, allowing him into the house. Jack followed her inside, but there was no urgency in his movements now. He wasn't there to demand or argue. He was there to listen. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a small, flickering hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. Maybe Jack could learn. Maybe they could both learn to live without the control, without the expectations. Maybe, after everything that had happened, there was still a way forward for them. They sat down in the living room, and for a long while, there was nothing but silence. It wasn't the heavy silence of before, the kind that made Margaret feel small and invisible. This silence felt different. It felt like a new beginning. Mom, Jack said after a while, his voice hesitant. I've been thinking about what you said about the house. About everything. And I realize now that I was wrong to try and take it from you. I don't want that. I don't want you to feel like I'm trying to control you. Margaret nodded, her expression softening. It's not just about the house, Jack, she said. It's about me being able to live my life the way I want to. It's about being seen. I've been invisible for too long, and I'm not going to let that happen anymore. Jack looked at her, his eyes filled with something close to regret. I understand, Mom. I really do. Margaret smiled, the first real smile she'd had in a long time. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't complete, but it was a start. It was the first step toward healing, toward rebuilding what had been broken. She didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt like she wasn't alone in the fight. She wasn't invisible anymore. And for now, that was enough.